In this lesson, let's discuss what Corda is and specifically understand how it came about. Before we talk about Corda itself, it's important to know that the organization that was responsible for developing Corda is called R3. R3 is an enterprise blockchain software firm that is really working with an ecosystem of 200 members and partners. When we hear Corda, it's usually going to be referred to as R3 Corda. Effectively, that is R3 specific blockchain deployment. Corda is open source. There's actually two specific deployments of Corda. There's Corda open source, which is available to the general public without any real cost. And then there's Corda Enterprise, which is a commercial version that is really meant for enterprises. Corda removes effectively what has typically been a challenge with financial institutions, and that's around the ability to have business transactions that are secure and private, but also high performing through the use of what's called a smart contract. It provides a competitive advantage and can also offer different ways of doing business effectively through the use of what would be called typically automation or actually a more decentralized form of finance. Now, with its inception, effectively, Corda was really built for the financial sector, mainly around specific business models. When it comes to Corda, it's important to know that R3 Corda is referred to as Corda, and those terms, whether it's R3 Corda or Corda, typically are used interchangeably. So it's pretty much fair use to use Corda or R3 Corda. It was developed in 2016, and it's really a private permission blockchain. It was developed first to record, manage, and automate financial agreements. We'll talk about the initial use cases coming up in the next lesson, but basically Corda was really designed to facilitate initially, for example, interest rate swaps. Now, Corda was, of course, marketed and built around financial use cases mainly. However, we'll talk about some of the other use cases such as reinsurance and logistics as well. Typically, when it came to Corda and how it came about, banks typically didn't have much of an incentive to build production level apps. In other words, because the banks typically work in more of a consortium approach or more of a partnering approach, generally they didn't really want to invest in applications that were going to be shared between each other. So effectively, Corda came out because it provided the financial institutions a way to cooperate, to work together, to help offer different product lines, and various other reasons that it came about was also to help facilitate reducing costs, increase trust, also reduce the time to market or the cost of transactions. And the really important aspect we'll talk more about of Corda coming up and the upcoming lessons will be mainly focused around how Corda provides basically what's called a need to know. It provides transparency and trust as well to the appropriate transactions and interactions on the blockchain. So it provides all of these capabilities to the customer base to where you can make sure as a financial enterprise that you have the right amount of security, privacy, transparency, and trust all built into the platform. Now, when it comes to other features that I think are really important to understand is that this is a distributed ledger And you're going to have, of course, different parties interacting with each other, such as central banks or intermediaries for that matter. And when it comes to Corda, it's also important to realize that R3, with its partnering institutions, has really enabled digital transformation. And it's enabled how these partner institutions, such as central banks, large investment banks, etc., communicate between each other. It's really, again, about trust, transparency, security, and privacy. And the blockchain itself was really meant to bring together all of these requirements in a solution that was really targeted for that industry. Now, it's important to know, too, when it comes to Corda, we'll talk more about these two different versions and how they're different. But generally, we have enterprise and then open source. So enterprise is basically where you have the partnering institutions that are using it for production, where they're going to have enterprise support, professional services, high availability. Open source is really put out there to give anyone any kind of capabilities to at least try it out and see how it works. It doesn't have the enterprise support. It doesn't have, for example, the ability to deploy multiple nodes. There's, again, limitations. And we can, of course, deploy Corda in a blockchain as a service. When it comes to smart contracts in Corda, these are effectively agreements that will execute pretty much by computer code with specific input and controls. Effectively, these are very similar to smart contracts and other blockchain platforms to a degree, but there's also significant differences as compared to other platforms. Effectively, with Corda, we have effectively the ability to implement what's called legal prose. This is basically language that we could add effectively via what's called an attachment to our core D app, which is effectively a smart contract application. Now, these distributed applications, of course, are going to be distributed among the nodes in the Corda network. These nodes need to reach an agreement, and the way they do that is via the logic and the data that we're going to attach to that smart contract. Now, the legal prose, of course, could be something fairly simple to something more complex. We'll talk more about that coming up in the sections further on in the course. It is important to realize that Corda does look at things a little differently. Effectively, core D apps are really going to take what is called definitions, and they're going to be written typically in Java or Kotlin. I'll discuss those more in the development part of the course. We'll get into, of course, some of the states, the contracts, the services. We also have the ability to add a whitelist and also APIs we'll get into. For this specific lesson, I wanted to just make you aware that the term core D app will be something we're going to see over and over and over. With that said, let's move on to lesson 2.